23 Republican governors just signed a formal letter refusing to enforce Trump's latest executive order. 23, not Democrats, not liberal activists. Republican governors from deep red states, including Texas, Florida, and Georgia, have collectively declared they will not comply with a directive from their own party's president. This is an act of constitutional defiance we haven't seen from within a single political party in modern American history. When the governors of states that delivered Trump his electoral victories openly refuse to carry out his orders, something catastrophic has fractured at the foundation of the Republican coalition. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So, what set off this unprecedented rebellion? A sweeping executive order signed on February 11th that would federalize state National Guard units and redirect state law enforcement resources without governor's consent. This isn't just another policy disagreement or budget squabble. This is a constitutional collision between federal authority and states' rights, the very principle Republicans have championed for decades. And believe me, when 23 governors from the president's own party publicly defy him in a joint letter, you know something enormous has just detonated. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions between the White House and Republican state executives have been simmering for months, fueled by escalating disputes over federal mandates, funding threats, and what governors have privately called executive overreach on an unprecedented scale. But everything exploded on February 11th when Trump signed Executive Order 14238, titled Restoring Federal Primacy in Domestic Security Operations. The order, spanning 14 pages, asserts broad federal authority to commandeer state National Guard units, redirect state and local law enforcement to federal operations, and withhold highway and infrastructure funding from states that refuse to comply. Sources familiar with the drafting process told reporters the order was prepared without consulting a single governor's office. Not one phone call, not one courtesy briefing. This wasn't about coordinating national defense or managing an emergency. It was about centralizing control over state resources for federally directed operations that multiple legal scholars have already called constitutionally suspect. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. When governors across the country reviewed the executive order's full text, they recognized immediately that this crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. And let's be honest for a moment, governors publicly breaking with a president from their own party is extraordinarily rare. It doesn't happen over routine policy disagreements or funding disputes. It happens when elected leaders believe a fundamental constitutional boundary has been violated, one that threatens the very sovereignty of the states they were elected to protect. The last time anything even approaching this level of intra-party defiance occurred was during the nullification crisis of the 1830s, and that nearly tore the country apart. Here's what multiple sources say happened next. On February 13th, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas convened an emergency conference call with Republican governors across the country. The call lasted nearly 3 hours. Within 48 hours, 23 governors had agreed to co-sign a letter formally refusing to enforce Executive Order 14238. The group included governors from Texas, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, Iowa, South Carolina, Virginia, and 14 other Republican-led states. Sources told NBC News that during the call, Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia stated that this order treats sovereign states like field offices of the federal government and that he took an oath to the people of Georgia, not to any president's political agenda. Meanwhile, Governor Kim Reynolds of Iowa reportedly told the group that the 10th Amendment is not a suggestion and that her state would not comply under any circumstances. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida released a separate statement calling the executive order a breathtaking assault on the 10th Amendment and the most dangerous expansion of executive authority he had witnessed in his career. By the evening of February 14th, the coalition had finalized and publicly released their joint letter. The letter accuses the administration of attempting to override state sovereignty, commandeer state resources without legislative authorization, and use financial coercion to compel compliance with directives that exceed constitutional executive authority. Reporters who obtained the full text noted that the language was unusually blunt, accusing the White House of treating governors as subordinates rather than as co-equal executives of sovereign states. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely explosive. When Governor Abbott held a press conference in Austin on February 15th to announce the coalition's position, he stood flanked by the attorneys general of 6 Republican states. Reporters described the atmosphere as combative and defiant. Abbott's voice was measured but unmistakably firm as he declared that Texas will not surrender its National Guard to federal requisition without the consent of its governor and its legislature. He added that any federal agent attempting to commandeer state law enforcement resources in Texas would be met with legal action within hours. That's when it became clear this isn't just another political disagreement. The bombshell moment came when Abbott revealed that the coalition had already filed a preliminary injunction in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas, seeking to block enforcement of the order before it takes effect on March 1st. Legal reporters covering the filing say the complaint is 87 pages long and cites 17 separate constitutional violations. This move sent shockwaves through Washington. When Republican governors publicly defy their own party's president and file federal lawsuits to block his executive orders, it signals one thing. The order is so constitutionally problematic that political survival now depends on opposing it rather than defending it. The claims of partisan overreach collapse entirely when the resistance is coming from within the president's own base. This isn't the first time governors have clashed with a president over the limits of federal authority. Think back to the resistance several Democratic governors mounted against federal immigration enforcement during the previous Trump administration. Republican leaders criticized those governors relentlessly, calling their defiance lawless and unconstitutional. The key difference now is stunning. Republicans are using the same constitutional arguments they once condemned because the federal overreach is coming from their own president. The irony is impossible to ignore. Then there was the standoff during COVID-19, when governors from both parties pushed back against federal mandates they considered overreaching. While tensions ran high, no coalition of 23 governors from the president's own party ever formally refused compliance and filed a federal lawsuit simultaneously. The scale of this rebellion is genuinely without modern precedent. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. And let's not forget the disputes over the Affordable Care Act, when Republican governors refused to expand Medicaid under the Obama administration. That was significant, but it involved declining optional federal programs, not actively defying a direct presidential order backed by explicit funding threats and legal consequences for individual governors. Now, however, it's fundamentally different. This time, governors are challenging the president's authority to commandeer their state resources entirely. The pattern is clear. When executive power expands to the point where it threatens state sovereignty, even the president's most loyal allies eventually reach a breaking point. Political loyalty alone cannot hold when constitutional principles are at stake. So what specifically triggered this unprecedented reaction? According to constitutional law experts who reviewed Executive Order 14238, the order violates several foundational principles of federalism enshrined in the Constitution and affirmed by the Supreme Court. The order reportedly asserts authority to activate and redirect state National Guard units for federal operations without gubernatorial consent. It directs state and local law enforcement agencies to participate in federal task forces as a mandatory condition for receiving highway and infrastructure funding. And it establishes a new federal compliance office with the power to withhold congressionally appropriated funds from states deemed non-cooperative. Here's the kicker. The order reportedly includes language stating that governors who refuse to comply may face personal legal liability for obstructing federal operations. This wasn't a request for cooperation or a negotiated federal-state partnership. It was an ultimatum backed by financial punishment and legal threats directed at elected state officials. Legal analysts say the personal liability provision is particularly alarming because it would allow the federal government to prosecute or sue governors for exercising their constitutional authority over their own state resources. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm everyone, regardless of political affiliation. This isn't just about one executive order or one policy dispute. If a president can commandeer state National Guard units without gubernatorial consent and threaten governors with personal legal liability for noncompliance, state sovereignty becomes functionally meaningless. Once that precedent is set, there's no turning back. Any future president, Democrat or Republican, could use the same framework to override state authority on any issue. This puts Republicans in Congress in a nearly impossible position. On one side, they face pressure from the White House and a base that remains fiercely loyal to the president, a base that views any Republican opposition as betrayal and treachery. That means defending the executive order, attacking the governors as disloyal establishment politicians, and framing the entire situation as an internal party power struggle. On the other side, they represent states whose governors, the most popular Republican officials in those states, are telling them this order is unconstitutional and dangerous. They now have to explain to their constituents why they support a president who is threatening their own governor with legal liability for defending state sovereignty. That's a position that is nearly impossible to justify in conservative states where states' rights have been a bedrock principle for generations. And here's the tricky part. There's no credible defense of the order. Either it's constitutional, in which case 23 Republican governors are wrong, and every conservative argument about limited federal government and states' rights was always empty rhetoric, or the order genuinely overreaches, which would require the White House to admit it went too far. Neither option is politically survivable for anyone defending the order. Legal and political analysts are calling this a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Lawrence Tribe, Harvard law professor and constitutional scholar, told CNN that Executive Order 14238 represents the most aggressive assertion of unilateral executive authority over state governments since Reconstruction. He explained that the 10th Amendment reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states, and that commandeering state resources for federal purposes violates decades of Supreme Court precedent, including the landmark rulings in Prince versus United States and New York versus United States. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Even Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law professor who frequently defends broad presidential authority, acknowledged that portions of the executive order raise serious constitutional concerns. He emphasized that while presidents have significant emergency powers, using funding threats to coerce state compliance with executive directives crosses a constitutional line that should concern everyone, regardless of party. A former federal prosecutor added that the personal liability provision targeting governors could itself violate the principles of intergovernmental immunity. Threatening elected state officials with prosecution for exercising their constitutional duties isn't just legally questionable. It could constitute an abuse of executive power. So let's break down what this could mean. First, the political impact is immediate and devastating. 23 Republican governors have handed every Democratic candidate a weapon for upcoming elections. Campaign ads are already being produced featuring Republican governors warning that their own president is threatening state sovereignty. This fractures the Republican coalition at its most fundamental level, the shared commitment to limited federal government and states' rights. Second, it creates a constitutional showdown in the courts. The preliminary injunction filed in Texas will likely be fast-tracked given the March 1st enforcement date. Legal experts predict the case could reach the Supreme Court within months, forcing conservative justices to rule on whether executive orders can override state sovereignty, a case that could redefine the balance of federal and state power for generations. Finally, looking ahead, the institutional implications are profound. If the executive order is upheld, it establishes a precedent that any future president from either party can commandeer state resources, threaten governors with legal liability, and use financial coercion to enforce compliance. Every Republican governor who signed that letter understands this isn't just about one president or one administration. It's about whether the office of the presidency has meaningful constitutional limits on its power over state governments. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate political fallout, this is really about fundamental constitutional principles. The 10th Amendment and the structure of federalism are foundational to the American system of government. They demand that state governments retain sovereignty over their own resources, their own law enforcement, and their own National Guard units, except under narrowly defined emergency circumstances. If a president can bypass all of that with a single executive order and a funding threat, the constitutional architecture that limits federal power and protects state authority is effectively demolished. This scenario is causing sheer panic within Republican leadership in Washington. Reports indicate that senior Republican senators held emergency conference calls to determine a unified response. Some argued for rallying behind the president and attacking the governors as disloyal establishment politicians seeking attention. Others insisted that defending an order their own governors are calling unconstitutional would be political suicide in their home states during the upcoming midterms. The party is fracturing in real time, torn between loyalty to the president and the foundational conservative principle of limited federal power and states' rights. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are absolutely furious at the governors who signed the letter. Social media is flooded with calls to primary every governor who broke ranks. They're being labeled traitors, rhinos, and establishment sellouts. To the base, this is the ultimate betrayal, proof that even Republican governors can't be trusted to stand behind the president. Things escalated further when Trump himself responded with a series of posts calling the governors weak, disloyal, and controlled by special interests who want open borders and weak national security. He singled out Abbott and DeSantis by name, calling them grandstanding politicians who care more about headlines than protecting Americans. He claimed the executive order is perfectly legal and vowed that states refusing to comply would face severe financial consequences, including the immediate suspension of federal highway funding. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view the situation. Here's what makes it even more extraordinary. Trump's response essentially confirmed the governor's concerns. Instead of addressing the constitutional arguments in the 87-page lawsuit or offering to negotiate the order's most contentious provisions, the reaction was personal attacks, name-calling, and threats of financial retaliation against states that dared to challenge him. When your defense is attacking the people questioning your authority rather than defending the legality of your actions, you've already lost the constitutional argument. Legal experts immediately flagged the problem. A former federal prosecutor told MSNBC that threatening states with funding cuts for exercising their constitutional right to challenge an executive order in court is itself potentially an abuse of power and could constitute obstruction of legal proceedings. It transforms a legitimate legal disagreement into political retribution, which undermines the rule of law itself. This goes far beyond a single executive order. It's about whether a president can override state sovereignty through unilateral executive action and financially punish governors who resist through lawful means. If there are no consequences for commandeering state resources without consent and threatening elected officials who object through the courts, it signals that federalism is dead as a constitutional principle. It's not just about this administration or this president. It's about whether the presidency itself has meaningful constraints on its power over state governments. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's where things stand right now. 23 Republican governors have formally refused to comply with a sitting president's executive order and filed an 87-page federal lawsuit to block it. The order attempts to federalize state National Guard units, commandeer state law enforcement, threaten governors with personal legal liability, and financially punish non-compliant states. Republican leaders across the country are watching closely to see whether their own party will defend the constitutional principles it has championed for decades, or whether loyalty to one president will override everything they claim to believe. This isn't just another news cycle that will fade away. This is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. What happens next could determine whether state sovereignty has any meaningful protection against executive overreach, regardless of which party holds the White House. Keep a close eye on this story. The preliminary injunction hearing is scheduled for February 26th in the Western District of Texas. More governors are reportedly considering joining the coalition before the hearing date. Legal teams on both sides are preparing for a case that constitutional scholars are already calling the most significant federalism dispute to reach the courts in decades. And millions of Americans across these 23 states are watching closely to see whether their governors' stand for state sovereignty will hold, or whether the federal government will force compliance through financial punishment and legal threats. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. The stakes have never been higher, the constitutional challenge has never been more direct, and the fracture within the Republican Party has never been more exposed. The evidence of overreach is documented in an 87-page federal complaint filed by governors from the president's own party. The demand for constitutional limits has been made by 23 elected leaders willing to put their political careers on the line. Now we wait to see if the courts, the Constitution, and the principle of states' rights still hold any weight against unchecked executive power. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage.